Hello, my name is Stewart Hotston. I think this is live now. So I have just spent the last 3 minutes waffling to myself after having pressed the go live button, which did not go live. But I am live now. It is saying, hey, we are live now. Good job, I spotted that before we went too much further. Um, this is where I'm working from home at the moment. I work in finance, and they sent us all home 3 weeks ago to continue working at home. So this is where I've been for basically the last 3 weeks. Apart from my mandated prison break every hour every day, where I get out of the house and kind of take the dog for a walk. Yeah, I was explaining when there was no downtime that those boxes there are effectively all my books in the world. We were due to start some building work, which has obviously been put on hiatus for the time being. But sadly, that means apart from the books over my shoulder, which you can see on that single bookshelf, that's the only one that's currently in the house, all my books are in boxes. When people say, what's your comfort read? Right now, I don't have a comfort read because all my books are in boxes and I can't get to them. And to be honest, I don't even know which books are in which boxes. There are all sorts of things. Whether I'm as likely to uncover a cookbook as I am an actual piece of fiction. So I can't just dig through, which has made me very sad. The books over my shoulder are the books I've been reading for the Clark Award. And I have to apologise for the way they're stacked, but there were many, many submissions to the Clark Award, and my single bookshelf simply couldn't take them to be stacked in good order with the spines facing out, so I could kind of browse through and know what I'm looking at. Essentially, they've gone on there as I read them. I finished essentially today or so, and very happy with that. But that is essentially what's happened. So we are now, I think in the UK, we are 7:31. I'm going to kind of talk nonsense for 2 or 3 more minutes to allow people to come on board. And then I will get on with reading the first chapter of a novel that is out with publishers at the moment. So it's not yet available for you to read, but it will be the first chapter of that novel. But before we do that, there is one comfort read I do have to hand, and that is The Complete Renaissance Swordsman. It's not fiction. It is actually a sword fighting manual. For those of you who don't know me, in one of my hobbies in my spare time is I fight with swords. I fight rapier, I fight side sword, and I fight all the companion weapons. You may ask yourself, what is a side sword? Well, I have one here. This is a side sword. You can just about see the whole thing. That tip there is that when I am sparring and fencing, I don't actually do a mischief to the people that I'm engaging with. That would be a bad thing. So, that being said, that little insight into how peculiar my life can be, I am going to start the reading. They ditched the club at 3. How could you lose a bloody shoe? Asked Joel for the 5th time. She looked down at her feet, her remaining shoe in her free hand, the other holding on to Joel. Please don't swear. I know exactly where it is, she said tiredly. It's on the counter in the women's toilets. Can you please just get us a taxi? He stared up and down the street. They'd made the mistake of walking away from the club and were now between it and the river on a quiet cobbled road full of steel shutters and railway arches. There was fat chance of anyone driving their way. At least it's okay to walk down the middle of the road, he thought. She clung on as they walked the mile to the river. Our best bet is to get up to South Bank, walk down to Waterloo. The smaller road spat them out onto a row of residential houses which fronted straight onto the road. She was focused on how much her feet hurt, but he frowned, unsure where they were. There wasn't any way to turn off, so they trundled along the road, passing a block of new-build flats to their left and a park to their right, the cast-iron railings keeping out all but those with keys to the gates. It used to be that they might have been able to cut through the grounds when it was government housing. Looking up into the pale blue pre-dawn sky, he could see one of the towers which lined the banks of the Thames. Knew it, he thought triumphantly. This way, he said, pulling her along a little too fast so she had to skip every couple of steps to keep up. We'll get to the river and cross one of the bridges. There'll be loads of taxis on the other side. Why don't we call an Uber? She asked, halting to rummage in her little snatch bag. Come on, he said, irritated he hadn't thought of it himself. We're almost there. I'll call one, she said. He shrugged. Tell them to meet us up by Blackfriars. She nodded, then said, we can get a cab from there, right? The phone went back into the bag. To his surprise, the South Bank was busy. People were milling, looking out onto the river, like cars on the motorway passing a crash. They must be filming a movie, she said to him as they emerged by Oxo Tower. Let's see if there's anyone famous. They pushed their way through the crowds, thoughts of bare feet forgotten. Ahead of them, on the river itself, brilliant streams of light reached up into the sky to caress the underside of the clouds hanging overhead. Shit, he said when they reached the river bank. She opened her mouth to tell him not to swear, but no words came out. It's a new bridge, he said to no one in particular. A group of 5 lads stood next to them, leaned in. It's a hoax, right? There are no new bridges, said one of them, a young man with a milk chocolate complexion who was glowing in the bridge's illumination. It looks like a bridge to me, said Joel. So there's no movie? One of the others high-fived his mate. I told you it was a movie. There aren't any film crews, said the other more dubiously. I just want to go home, she said. Leaving them bickering, she started towards the bridge. A space opened up around her as no one else wanted to step onto it. She didn't notice she was alone until she was halfway across. Joel, she shouted, seeing him hesitating at the edge of the crowd. He looked around, but before she needed to call him again, he scooted along to catch her up. The lights, although dazzling, were softer on the bridge, as if they changed for her so she wouldn't be blinded by their brilliance. She grabbed hold of Joel's hand and pulled him along. Under her feet the ground was soft, spongy, like walking on warm carpet. It's lovely, this. Joel looked as she pulled him along to see those who'd been hanging back starting their own journey across. We're trending, he said. Many of those following behind had their phones out, were filming their journeys or taking selfies. We might be the first people across, he said to her. She giggled and clung on to him a little harder. I'm the first, she said. What? I'm the first. You wimped out until I stepped on the bridge. Someone zipped past them, running full pelt. Hey, she shouted, I'm the first. Joel laughed. She slapped him on the arm and then took off. He stood there a moment watching her stretch ahead, her legs pumping and feet pounding on the bridge. Someone else overtook him, then half a dozen all running and whooping together. Wait for me, he shouted after her. He moved to the side of the bridge, saw for the first time how the smooth, black surface of the road stepped into a high curb. The pavement was wide, enough for 4 people to walk next to one another, laid with smooth white stone and bounded on the outside by stonework railings. Delicately carved, but in a simple, minimal style. He couldn't see where any of the lights actually were. There were no light fittings, nothing in the road or the pavement, no lights hidden under the balustrade. Joel squat down, peered at the underside of the railing, then looked up into the sky. The early morning purples were bathed in golden light. Up and down the bridge, light suffused the air, as if it were heavy as damp linen. Joel stood up, and where his hand had pressed against the floor an outline remained, an azure afterglow with bronze, fading away as he watched. This is whacked, he said. He realised she was nowhere in sight. He scurried across the rest of the bridge, could see embankment where it turned into Blackfriars underpass, getting closer until, suddenly, he couldn't. Those who had gone ahead had jammed up in front of him as if there were no exit, like tomato sauce in a new bottle. Joel shouted her name, calling and pushing his way to the front. Those around him were mostly inert, calmly letting him scrabble past. His stomach turned over at the thought of not being able to find her. He tried telling himself she'd be able to get home. She was a grown woman, smarter than him, better paid. His pep talk didn't help. He wanted to slap at people to get them all out of the way, to have them kneel down so he could see clearly. Then, just like that, there she was. She had her back to him, was staring into the distance. Emily, he said, grasping hold of her hand. She turned to look at him for a moment before sliding her gaze back to what was in front of them. Now he knew she was safe. Joel focused on what was going on around them. Fucking hell. I know, said Emily. Before them, a city in white stone, steel and glass, shining in the pale dawn light, towers rising up, roads smooth and clean. Joel stared back across the bridge and could see the sparkling yellows, whites and oranges of London at night. Could see red brake lights from further along, the flashing reds, greens and whites of planes overhead. On all sides the new city rose up from the river. To the north-east, towers rose as high as anything in the city of London, while to the north and west he could see low-rise stone buildings, like those of Kensington and Mayfair. Yet the skyline was cleaner. There weren't any out-of-place skyscrapers to the west, among the more modest buildings. And somehow they'd managed to create a scene of rising buildings reaching a peak, before dropping back down in height the further east he looked. He could have drawn a smooth curve over the tops of the buildings, rising up from one side before dropping down the other. Immediately before them was a huge plaza laid down in white stone slabs, ranging in size from no bigger than stamps to platforms as long and wide as a bus. He couldn't make sense of the pattern they made from ground level, but guessed it would be spectacular when seen from above. 5 large roads led away from the plaza in an arc, the grand avenues they cut into the city, granting clear line of sight until the undulating hills on which the city was built obscured his view. He didn't stare long. He wanted to see the city ahead, to get into it, and discover what lay beyond this first impression. Because for sure, this was not London. No embankment, no Blackfriars, no tipper trucks thundering along Lower Thames Street. A train pulled into the station on their right, but he couldn't see it through the golden haze of the bridge. Was the noise from Blackfriars, or a station on the other side? No one stepped forward into this new city. "There's no one there," he said, suddenly connecting what was missing from the picture in front of him. No cars, no anything. The sky beyond was black, scattered with stars embedded in a white blur which ran across the heavens as if someone had blown chalk dust up into the night. "I don't recognise the constellations," said a woman next to him. "Astronomer, are you, love?" smirked a large, balding man in a dishevelled suit. "Yes, actually," she said. "We should be able to see Cassiopeia and Ursa Major for a start." "It's amazing," said Amelie. She stepped off the bridge and onto dry land. Behind her they held their breath, not knowing what they were scared of, but waiting to see what befell her before following. "Jesus," said someone pointing at the ground. Joel looked down to see small flowers growing up and unfurling around Amelie's feet. They grew without breaking the slabs of the plaza, their stalks growing up and through the ground as if it were earth and not stone. She walked on uncaring, head lifted up as she stared at the city. "There's no one here," she called back to Joel. Her words broke the spell holding everyone else back, and they fell into the city, shouting, whooping and calling to one another as they did so. Among them hundreds of people scattered up into the city proper, quickly reaching the edge of the plaza and disappearing from sight. Joel stepped in behind Amelie, watching as nothing blossomed under his own feet. He saw a man on his knees praying, another scraping at the space where 2 perfectly fit together paving slabs met. Where their fingers touched the ground, it turned brown, as if someone had spilt sewage on the ground. Skirting around them, he caught up with Amelie. The bridge was out of sight. He tugged on her hand gently, insistently, until she slowed down to look at him. "Where are we?" He saw her eyes come into focus. "This isn't London," he said. She stared back down the hill they'd climbed. "Can we go back?" The thought hadn't occurred to him. He suddenly really wanted to be back in London. True London. They walked back down to the riverbank. They came out a few hundred feet from where the bridge touched down. "There's London," he said with relief. They could see their home on the other side of the river. The sun was nearly up and the sky was streaks of burnt yellows and palest blues. "I want to go home," said Amelie. As they approached the bridge, they saw police lined up across the entrance. People were pushing and shoving, but without being allowed to cross back into London. Joel and Amelie approached slowly. About 30 metres from the bridge, a police officer dressed in riot gear addressed them via loud hailer from the bridge. "Please stay back. You may not cross back into London at this time." A man nearby shouted at the police. More of those who they'd crossed over with were collecting on the plaza around the bridge. A large group of people, still in their Saturday night on the town clothes, pushed at the police, shouted in their faces, but were met with silence. They backed off until one, pulling a short knife from his pocket, ran at the barricades. The police acted quickly, falling back a little while those on either side swept around the sides and hit him behind the knees with batons. He tumbled to the ground, his knife skittering across the stone out of reach. Instead of stopping, the officers continued to strike him as he curled up, arms around his head, knees collected into his chest. Each time they struck him, the air filled with a deep bass, a groan which echoed through the ground they stood on. Slowly the police stopped their assault and restrained their attacker. Others glanced around the plaza nervously, and Joel didn't know if he was more frightened of the noise which accompanied the beating, or that the police might do the same to him as well. As the attacker was dragged away and secured against a fence running alongside the river, the noise stopped. Amelie let go of Joel's arm. "What was that?" she asked. Joel pointed. The ground where the man had been beaten was blood red, the stones cracking with loud noises like corn popping in a saucepan. All around them the city groaned as thick scarlet liquid dripped from the walls, and the light hanging in the air turned grey, then deepened into a bruised midnight blue. He wanted to run, but there was no way he'd get to the bridge. Fleeing deeper into the city was out of question. The officer with a loud hailer instructed the crowd to kneel down. Joel thought it was a good idea and did as he was told. Amelie hesitated, but after a few moments followed suit. "I thought this place was wonderful," she said, "but we ruined it the moment we arrived." The flowers around her feet withered. The police line bulged out from the entrance to the bridge. Joel risked turning his head to each side, could see most people hadn't knelt as they'd been told. Others were returning from wherever they'd been exploring, and the plaza was filling up with confused and frightened strangers. Amelie's hand snaked out and took hold of his. "I'm scared," she said. "Me too," he said, and she squeezed his hand. "Why won't people just do what they're told?" A young lad a few feet away was still on his feet. He was shouting at the police to let them through. "Just do what they're telling us," hissed Joel in his direction. The lad, in jeans and an expensive shirt with gel-back hair, looked at him for a moment before returning his attention to the police. "They've got guns," said Amelie hesitantly. "That can't be right," said Joel. "The police don't carry guns." He focused on where she was looking and saw people in face masks and black armour sliding between the ordinary officers. "Who the hell are they?" "How'd they get here so quickly?" asked Amelie. "Did they know about this before us?" She stood up. Joel grabbed at her arm, but she wouldn't kneel down again. She started walking towards them. The armed officers were aiming right at them. Joel stared at the ground Amelie left in her wake. It was bubbling as if hot, like boiling toffee. He got up and ran after her, a few short steps bringing him alongside. "What are you thinking?" he asked her. "They can't shoot us," she said firmly. "We've done nothing wrong." It occurred to him the police were just as scared as everyone else. Others were approaching the officers as well. The loud hailer continued to belt out the same instructions to get down on the floor with their hands behind their heads. Overhead, clouds had scudded across the clear sky and rain began to patter around them, large fat drops which hit hard. Hand to his forehead, Joel checked the black clouds overhead, half expecting lightning to strike the ground in the middle of them. Two people reached the police and were immediately met with baton blows. They raised their arms and ducked their heads as they fell back. Amelie and Joel drew to a stop, their feet shuffling without being asked as they watched the melee. To their left, several dozen people had grouped together in a tight-knit crowd. They were advancing on the bridge. Joel tightened his grip on Amelie's hand. The riot police stepped ahead of their unarmed comrades and pointed their rifles at the advancing mob. The loud hailer warned them they would be fired upon if they didn't stop right then. The crowd ignored the warning, feet passing one in front of the other. They closed the distance, hollering as they stepped. The police remained quiet, their rectangular riot shields held out in front of the armed officers. The protesters made it another 10 steps. Joel reckoned they were 30 feet from the cordon in front of the bridge. On the 11th step, the police opened fire. Joel ducked down until he realised the officers were firing at the front of the crowd who'd been advancing on them. The bullets hit people in the chest, knocking them off their feet. The crowd scattered, people screaming, bodies rolling on the floor where they'd been hit, curled up to protect themselves from further injuries. "Stop it!" screamed Amelie. "Get down," said Joel, pulling at her. "They're shooting them," she cried. "They're using plastic bullets. No one's going to get hurt." He was just happy they weren't shooting at him. "Why are they shooting at us at all?" she asked, tugging on his hand, trying to drag him forward. He pulled back. "They warned them. They didn't listen. All they had to do was listen and obey." She glanced down at him in disgust. "Since when did we live in a police state? They need a cause to act. People don't need to prove their innocence. The burden is not on us." "I agree with you," he said, trying to pull her down into a crouch. "But is now the time to be debating this?" She wrenched her hand out of his grip. "Now is exactly the time." She sounded furious, and he shied away from the disappointment in her eyes. "Amelie," he called as she stormed toward what was left of the crowd. Most of them were lying on the floor. Others were trying to reach the safety of the nearest streets, but they were a couple of 100 metres from the city proper, and the police were taking pot shots at anyone who moved. The loud hailer instructed everyone to stay where they were, told them not to leave the plaza. Amelie picked up the pace until she stood over a woman with a bloody face, lying dazed on the ground and unable to speak. She turned to the line of police officers and, walking towards them, held out her hands in front of her. "Stop this," she shouted. "We aren't rioting. We haven't done anything wrong. You have no right to do this." Joel watched the line as half a dozen officers turned their guns towards her. Finally, finding his feet again, he ran at her. Amelie continued to walk at the officers. One of them shouted at her to get back or they'd fire. "What you're doing is wrong," she countered. "It's illegal. Let us back across the bridge." The officer told her to stop, said they wouldn't warn her again. Amelie stopped. Joel stopped as well, relieved she'd seen sense. "Come and get me," she shouted. "Step into this city and come and get me." No one moved. Joel watched her stand there, a pool of calm amid the chaos of fear and terror all around. The ground at her feet shone silver and the flowers were back, growing up in a circle around her. In contrast, the stonework across the rest of the plaza had turned black, streaks of hot orange throbbing as if a great creature struggled just beneath the surface. Stones shifted in their placements, cracking where people walked on them, flaking and crumbling. Joel realised he was wet through and wiped rainwater from his forehead. "Cowards!" shouted Amelie. "You're all cowards. You're scared of this place, of us. You shouldn't be scared of us. What are they going to do to you when you return?" The rest of the crowd was pacified, having fled or laying still on the ground. The sound of the wounded and battered mingled with the sound of the downpour, and it was the saddest thing Joel had ever heard. The police didn't move. Joel expected them to round everyone up when they were sure it was safe. He'd recalled movies he'd seen about outbreaks of deadly diseases and expected interviews, processing, power washes with hosepipes. He wanted Amelie to stop now. She was the only one still standing, the only one talking back at them. Amelie pointed at the police, fury rising off her like steam. "Let us through. We're no danger to anyone." For the first time she showed awareness of the flowers at her feet. Look at the ground. I'm right. I am good. The city knows it. It's not infecting us. We're infecting it." The officers shifted, but no one spoke. The loudhailer had gone quiet, as if struck dumb in the face of her peaceful defiance. She took a step. There was a loud, hollow bang. Joel saw the plastic bullet hit her in the face, and then she was falling to the floor. The blooms beneath her crumbled to dust, as if they'd turned straight to ash. The plaza groaned like it was being bent against its will. Hands burst through the ground where she lay unmoving. They were thin, skeletal, singed and blackened as if burnt, and they grabbed hold of her body. Joel screamed. He saw police officers rushing forward, heedless of their line, heading straight for Amelie. He knew it was too late. The bullet had hit her in the face, had been fired at the ground instead of at her chest, ricocheting up without control and striking her under the chin. She'd been so close to them. He wanted the ground to open up and swallow them all, to rinse them with fire for destroying the only good thing in his life. The plaza shattered open, stones falling into darkness as a fissure snaked its way between the city and the bridge, blocking the police from reaching Amelie's body. Joel saw people filming on their phones and wished they'd help him instead. He ran for Amelie, but the hands were swimming through the plaza as if it were water, and in their grasp Amelie's body moved with them. Joel gave chase until flames rose up from the fissure, spilling out lumps of stone that burned and spit where they landed. He ducked under one as big as his head as it flew through the air. Amelie was gone. He frantically turned one way then another, but couldn't see any sign of her. The broiled hands had vanished. He sank to his knees and wept, the anger leaving him alone with his loss. The rain intensified, putting the fires out and filling the air with an invasive, acrid smell of boiling tar. Joel lost track of time until hands were laid on his shoulder and kind words were whispered into his ears as he was led towards the bridge and back to London. He didn't remember anything else about that night, except when they sat him down to get his statement, he realised he was still holding Amelie's shoe. Well, thank you very much. Following me in about 5 minutes or so will be Foz Meadows, who will also be, I think, doing some reading of her work. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you, Susan, for saying that was a nice sword. It is one I have used in earnest in tournaments as well as in sparring, and has served me quite well, although it is relatively new. I was going to show you a rapier, but my rapier is in pieces at the moment because when I travel, actually, because of UK law, I can't travel with the rapier fully built up as a sword because the bags I use aren't quite big enough, and you're not allowed to travel in public with what could be construed as a deadly weapon. So I tend to kind of take it to pieces and put the individual pieces in a bag and then carry that bag with me so that it's no danger and not seen as any danger. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that, and I will be tuning in for Foz in about 5 minutes. Thank you. Bye-bye.